So this is Baruch Fleischman, Tikkun Elevator Kollel, back to bring you also on the Dvekus channel with Rabbi Mimran, the ultimate connection with God's 7-step guide to Jewish spirituality. Now understand that people are not used to this. Here's a man coming along and teaching you how to acquire Ruach Hakodesh. He's talking about you and me, just regular people who read English. And he says that the situation, all the Kabbalists say the same way. Back in Europe, when everybody was poor, back in Morocco, where nobody had anything, someone would come along and they had been trained. There would be an individual amongst many who really couldn't lift their heads up because of the situation in which they were born. Poverty. But here in the United States and the world together is a time of plenty. So we have leisure. We have the opportunity to be able to get and expand our minds. But we are also surrounded by terrible klipos. You have homosexuality, you have pornography, you have just all kinds of lewdness every place in the American society. Someone comes and he says, I can show you how to really understand what's going on, what God is doing in the world by teaching you how to acquire Ruach Hakodesh. That's for anybody in the world that we live in, because it's much, much worse than previous generations. Let's see what he says like this. There are a few spelling mistakes here, and we're going to go through it. We're going to read the English. He says, they quote like this, "This we learn," and this is from the Yavitz. He says, from a saying from Moshe Rabbeinu, and choose life. So again, from a saying, Moshe Rabbeinu says, and choose life. Life here, eternity. You can reach it. The pasuk is warning us, it means warning us, to choose life for ourselves, which is another word for Dvekus, with Hashem, becoming one with Him, since He is the source of life. Now, this is a little complicated, the ideas that he wants to say, Rabbi Mimran, here. So let's look at it and see if we can gather it up. Before we talked about the ego, and he says the ego is the Yetzer Hara. That's the part that's working against your growth. He says the Yetzer Hara is very cunning, so you have to be very alert, very aware, and totally honest with yourself to see whether you have truly relinquished your identification with mental positioning. So here's a phrase that he's talking right now. Mental positioning. I can't let this happening. I got to make sure I get that done. I go this way and so on and so forth. You're constantly looking about what this eye needs to do. And so freed yourself from your egoic mind. So let's see again. You see, whether you have truly relinquished your identification with mental positioning, and so freed yourself from your egoic mind. If you will suddenly feel very light, clear, and deeply at peace, right? Because we're always struggling. There's always fights going on in our heads. That is unmistakable sign that you have truly surrendered and connected to your higher self, to that will that is driving you. Then observe what happens to the other person's mental position. Then you could see what's going on with other people, what their mental positions are, as you no longer energize it through resistance. Now, I think that what he meant was, I would translate this for myself, that if you were in a situation where you had what we call mochen dekadlus, that there's trouble all around you. Everywhere you see, everywhere you look, it's a problem, and it keeps going through your head. What are you going to do about it? And that's what he said, your mental position. So over here we come along and we say, but it is possible to grow beyond that. To first of all recognize what your state is and understand who is the recognizer. Then recognize the thoughts that are surrounding it. And then you become a different person. And then you could look back to the other person's mental position as you no longer energize it through resistance. You are no longer resisting. In other words, the fight that's going on in your head, do this, do that, don't do this, why did you do that? Go this constant concept that is going on. Why did that man say this to you? What does this mean? Going back and forth, back and forth. When the identification with mental positions is out of the way, but if you can avoid that, and he's saying that you can rise beyond that, true communication begins. So he said, let's go back. Again, non-resistance and acceptance. So here you are, he's saying this idea, which I've seen in other places before, said by people from different directions. He says that, again, non-resistance and acceptance does not necessarily, turn the page here, mean doing nothing. So you're having this conflict that's going on in your head. Non-resistance doesn't mean doing nothing. All it means is that any doing is totally monitored and controlled with intelligence. So you're looking at what you are thinking. And this is the intelligent part, as opposed to irrational and spontaneous reactions and retaliations. How many times have your feelings been hurt, and you struck out? So he says, actually, the wisdom underlying the practice of Eastern martial arts is to not resist the opponent's force. So he's coming at you with a tremendous amount of force. Don't. He says, but to yield, to overcome. Let it go. And then the idea is that you'll come around, you'll take that force and you'll use it yourself. This is the art of acceptance. So it's an art. Something that we have to practice. So he said, going on, moreover, doing nothing when you are in a state of alert awareness is a very powerful transformer and healers of situations and people. You're in a conflict situation. So you stand and now you're able to see what's going on around you. You are actually creating healing through passivity. By not getting involved and yielding to the emotion of the situation, you're able to look at it. It is radically different from inactivity in the ordinary state of consciousness, or rather unconsciousness. It's very different. It's an alertness of the situation, which stems from fear, laziness, or indecisions. That is, it just doing nothing with your brain. The real doing nothing implies inner non-resistance. So the real doing nothing implies this concept, which he's now calling inner non-resistance and intense alertness. In other words, alertness is that you're watching what's going on in your head. You're watching the conversation that's going on, and you're letting it go and watching it. If action is required, and then if you have to do something, because let's say there's some real physical danger, you will no longer react from your conditioned mind. It won't be just a position that you had, which he's calling now the positioned mind, the conditioned mind, but you will respond to the situation via your inner intuitive soul presence, because now you're looking out, which is your soul's intelligence. The ego believes that in your resistance lies your strength. Now, this is what the ego believes. It fights. So therefore, your strength is your ability to be able to fight. This is fighting the conversation that's going on in your mind. Just imagine what's going on in your head when you go to say the Shemona Esrei, when you're praying the silent prayer. It says all kinds of thoughts go through your head. Whereas in truth, resistance and rash retaliation cuts you off from your true power. So here he's saying like this. He says, now all these thoughts are coming into your head. You try to push them out, push them out, push them out. Pushing them out is the same thing that they're doing. They're pushing in, you're pushing out. It's just a big push concept. So he said, but the way you do this is you stop doing that. As stated in timeless teaching of our sages in Pirkei Avos, who is he who is strong? So he said that strong person is one who conquers his Yetzer Hara, his egoic self. It doesn't mean that you're going to conquer it and it won't be there anymore. It means you're going to control it. Resistance is weakness, and fear masquerading as strength. So the concept of resistance, which would mean fighting that goes on in your brain all the time, is really weakness. It's fear masquerading as strength. What the ego sees as weakness is your true self in its impurity, because the ego doesn't think there's anything to be said about what intelligence are you talking about. You got to take care of this situation. If you don't do it, So he said, what the ego sees as weakness is your true self in its purity, innocence, holiness, and power. The ego thinks this is all weakness. What it sees as strength is weakness. So what the resistance, which is what the ego sees as strength, is really weakness. So the ego insists in a continuous resistance mode and plays counterfeit roles to cover up your weakness, which in truth is your power. So therefore, it does all kinds of different ways. I say to cover up your weakness. The counterfeit roles means it basically ignores it. It goes on to what it conceives as the most important threat and the fight that you have to keep running in your head. Until there is acceptance and alert awareness, unconscious role-playing constitutes a large part of human interaction. We have preset ideas about who people are. I don't think there's anyone who's more like that than me. Trying to understand people by preset ideas. In acceptance to what is, but then you could also go like this. You can accept what is. You no longer need ego defenses and false masks. You become very simple, very real. That's dangerous, says the ego. You'll get hurt. You'll become vulnerable. You got to protect yourself. What the ego doesn't know, of course, is that only through the letting go of resistance, through becoming vulnerable, can you discover your essential invulnerability. Read it again. He said the letting go of resistance. In other words, you have to realize that this is a part of you. You see this in Kabbalah, that the Klipa Noga, which is part good, part bad, it means the Yetzer Tov, Yetzer Hara. They're a part of us. The only way that we can control them is by understanding that they're there and looking at them and seeing what they're doing, and then seeing what's the proper course. That's using your higher intelligence, and this is the concept also of bringing in Mochin Gadlus. So becoming through. So he says only through the letting go of resistance, through becoming vulnerable. The concept of the broken heart. The person doesn't know what to do. Can you discover your essential invulnerability, which is the eternity that lives within you, and ultimately your true connection with your Creator. Last blurb, resistance is weakness, and fear masquerading as strength. There's a lot to think about in this chapter. It points out a lot of failings that I have. This is Baruch Fleischman at the Tikkun Elevator Kola.